It was a dark and quiet evening in the heart of the city, a night that seemed like any other. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the hum of traffic was the only sound breaking the stillness. Inside a small, humble restaurant, a man sat alone at a corner table. Dressed in simple black attire, his face calm and unreadable, Steven Seagal appeared to be just another quiet patron, no different from the others around him. He was the last person anyone would expect to be involved in anything remotely dangerous. Outside, the atmosphere was charged with a different energy. A group of Mafia enforcers, rough-looking men with dangerous reputations, strode confidently down the sidewalk. They were loud, laughing, and full of swagger, their presence commanding attention. Their leader, Luca, a large man with a scar running down the side of his face, was at the forefront. He was notorious in the underworld, feared for his ruthlessness and quick temper. Luca and his crew had a reputation for handling business in the most brutal way, and tonight, they had a score to settle. Luca had heard rumors about a quiet man who frequented the restaurant, someone who had been making waves in the wrong circles. There were whispers that this man was more than just an ordinary guest. Maybe he was a rival, maybe someone who owed money. But Luca wasn't about to let anyone disrupt his territory. Tonight, he intended to teach whoever this man was a lesson. As the Mafia entered the restaurant, they scanned the room for their target, their eyes falling on Steven Seagal. Sitting still, alone, not making a fuss. He didn't seem like a threat. But to Luca, that's exactly what made him suspicious. Anyone who didn't fit into the chaos of the underworld, anyone who looked too calm, too controlled, was a potential problem. Luca approached with his crew, grinning and making sure the people around them could see who they were. As they drew closer to Steven's table, the atmosphere seemed to shift. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. But no one could have predicted just how wrong things would go for Luca and his men. Seagal didn't even flinch. When Luca reached his table, he merely looked up, meeting the Mafia leader's eyes with a steady, unshakable gaze. The storm that was about to erupt started in the calmest of moments. The Mafia was used to getting what they wanted, and they were accustomed to fear. Every business in town, every small-time operator, every street corner was theirs to control. They thrived on intimidation, on making people bend to their will without ever lifting a finger. But there was something about this quiet restaurant that set their instincts on edge. Steven Seagal, however, did not seem like the type of man who needed to intimidate anyone. He was calm, composed, and completely unbothered by the presence of the thugs as they approached him. The contrast between Seagal's unruffled demeanor and the Mafia's brashness created a tension that nobody in the room could ignore. Even the other patrons, who had been dining in peace, couldn't help but glance over at the group as they swaggered past, their eyes darting nervously between the Mafia men and the calm figure. At the corner table, Luca, the leader of the crew, was a large man who wore his power like a second skin. His well-tailored suit, expensive watch, and cocky grin made him seem invincible. He had spent years building his reputation, crushing anyone who dared to cross him. His crew followed him like loyal dogs, believing wholeheartedly that they were untouchable, that there was no man alive who could stand up to them. And yet here was Steven Seagal, an unassuming figure with a quiet intensity that seemed to challenge their very presence. As the Mafia reached Steven's table, Luca's voice cut through the air, thick with condescension. "Mind if we join you?" Luca asked, a smirk playing at the edges of his lips. His tone was a deliberate mix of mock politeness and thinly veiled hostility. Steven Seagal didn't respond immediately. He simply regarded Luca with a calm, almost detached gaze. There was no fear in his eyes, no anxiety. He wasn't interested in playing games or exchanging taunts. He was simply observing. "Why so quiet, my friend?" Luca continued, taking a step closer to the table. "A man who keeps to himself in a place like this must be hiding something, don't you think? What's your name?" Still Seagal said nothing, his expression unreadable. It was as if he hadn't heard Luca at all. The other members of the Mafia began to circle, their posture threatening, their eyes narrowing in suspicion. Luca could see that his show of bravado wasn't having the desired effect. The man before him wasn't trembling in fear or scrambling to explain himself. He wasn't even speaking. It was unnerving. "That's how it's going to be, huh?" Luca's voice grew more forceful, his tone dripping with contempt. Well, I think we need to have a little talk about who's in charge around here. Seagal continued to sit still, hands resting on the table, his gaze never wavering from Luca's. His silence was as powerful as any words could have been. Luca sneered, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. I think you might want to look at this, he said, slamming the paper down on the table. It's the kind of thing that makes a man like you reconsider his attitude. But if you're not interested in talking, maybe we'll just help you understand where your place is. The paper fluttered in front of Seagal, but he didn't even glance at it. His focus remained on Luca, as if the Mafia leader didn't even deserve the energy to look at the document. A few of Luca's men chuckled nervously, unsure of how to react to this. They had seen men squirm before, seen them beg for mercy when faced with Luca's dominance. But this man, this quiet, composed figure, was a mystery. He wasn't reacting the way they expected, and that only heightened the tension. Luca's grin widened, but it was a grin full of arrogance and irritation. He leaned in closer to Steven's face. You know, he said slowly, you're starting to get on my nerves. You're not the first person who's come into my city thinking they're above the rules. But you'll learn. We'll make sure of it. Seagal's eyes never left Luca's. But there was a faint, almost imperceptible glint of something in them. Something cold, calculating, and terrifying. Listen, Luca, Seagal said, his voice low but steady. It's clear you don't know who I am. You're making a mistake. Luca's jaw tightened, but he didn't back away. A mistake? He scoffed. You've already made your mistake by sitting at this table, thinking you're some kind of before Luca could finish his sentence. Seagal stood up, his movements fluid and quick, like a coiled spring releasing. The restaurant's air seemed to shift in that moment. A subtle change, almost imperceptible to anyone but Luca and his crew. Seagal was not just a quiet man. He was a man who moved with purpose, with control. Luca's hand dropped to his jacket, his fingers brushing the cold metal of a gun he had hidden there. But before he could draw it, Seagal was already on him, stepping forward with lightning speed. The Mafia members barely had time to react. One tried to grab Seagal from behind, but Seagal spun, his elbow connecting with the man's face with a sickening crunch. Another lunged at him with a knife, but Seagal sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it until the blade clattered to the floor. Luca staggered back, shocked at how quickly things had escalated. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the quiet man to be so capable. The other thugs, now panicking, reached for their weapons, but Seagal was already 3 steps ahead. In a blur of motion, he disabled the next 2 men, taking them out with precise strikes to the throat and ribs. The restaurant, once filled with the clatter of silverware and the murmur of conversation, was now silent, except for the sound of Luca's crew groaning in pain. Luca's eyes widened. This wasn't just some quiet man. This was something else entirely. Seagal's voice was calm as he addressed the leader. You should never have come here, Luca. And with that, the tables had turned. Luca stood there, frozen, his mouth agape, struggling to process the chaos unfolding before him. His mind, which had always been sharp when it came to dealing with his enemies, couldn't make sense of what was happening. His crew, the same men who had walked in with swagger and confidence, were now writhing on the floor, clutching their limbs in pain. They were helpless, completely at the mercy of this one man. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how things worked. Seagal stood in the center of the room, his expression calm and composed as though nothing extraordinary had just occurred. He didn't even seem winded. His movements were slow, controlled, deliberate, as if he were merely going through the motions of something mundane, like brushing dust off a table or adjusting his collar. His gaze never left Luca, who was now visibly rattled, the arrogance he once carried melting into confusion and fear. The remaining Mafia men, a few of them still trying to recover from the blows they had taken, began to realize just how out of their depth they were. They had underestimated this man from the start. They had expected to bully him, to exert their power over him, but instead, they had been met with swift and overwhelming force. Steven Seagal was not just a man. He was something else entirely, a force of nature. Luca, now visibly sweating and panicking, backed away from Seagal, his mind racing for any way out of the situation. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed a number, but his hands were shaking so much that he dropped the device. A moment later, it shattered on the floor, the sound echoing through the room like the final nail in the coffin. Seagal didn't move. He didn't need to. His mere presence was enough to send Luca into a spiral of uncertainty. "Who are you?" Luca managed to croak, his voice cracking. He had been in enough dangerous situations to know when he was outmatched, but this was something different. "What are you doing here?" This is our town. You can't just walk in here and—" Seagal cut him off with a soft, almost indifferent laugh. "I didn't walk in here looking for trouble, Luca. You brought it to me." Luca's face twisted in rage, but there was no power behind it now, just frustration and fear. He took a step forward, trying to regain some semblance of control. But Seagal wasn't intimidated in the slightest. He had seen men like Luca 100 times before, brash, overconfident, and blind to their own weakness. "Listen to me," Luca continued. "I'm not afraid of anyone. You don't know who you're messing with. We run this city. We own everything." Seagal tilted his head slightly, considering Luca's words. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of understanding. He spoke again, but this time his voice was softer, more reflective. "The problem with men like you, Luca, is that you think your power comes from the things you control. Money, weapons, people. But real power, true power, comes from within. It's quiet, unshakable. It doesn't need to make noise." Luca, still standing there, could feel his composure slipping with each word. Seagal spoke. He had never encountered anyone who could speak so confidently, so calmly, in the face of certain destruction. His crew was down, defeated, and his own body was beginning to betray him. His hands were trembling uncontrollably, and his mind was racing through every possible way he could salvage the situation. But the truth was staring him in the face. There was no way out. Seagal stepped forward, the sound of his boots hitting the floor cutting through the tense silence. "I think it's time you left," he said simply, his voice a quiet command. Luca, now desperate, tried to summon the last shred of his bravado. "You think I'm just going to walk away? You think you've won? I'll have you." Before Luca could finish, Seagal moved again. He didn't rush. He didn't even seem to hurry. With an effortless move, he reached out and grabbed Luca by the collar, lifting him off the ground with surprising strength. Luca gasped, his legs kicking helplessly in the air as he stared at Seagal, wide-eyed. "You're still not getting it, are you?" Seagal asked, his grip tightening. "You had all the power in the world and now look at you." Luca, hanging in the air, his face turning red, managed to sputter. You can't do this. I'll have you." But his threats were cut off by the sound of footsteps in the distance. Seagal's grip loosened just enough for Luca to gasp for breath, but Seagal's eyes remained locked on him, unflinching. His calm presence contrasted starkly with Luca's frantic movements. The footsteps grew louder, and before anyone could react, the restaurant door swung open. 3 men in black suits, walking with urgency, entered. They weren't Mafia thugs, they were far more official looking. The first one, a tall man with a crisp suit and sharp features, addressed Seagal immediately. "Mr. Seagal, we've been looking for you." He spoke with the utmost respect, his tone unmistakably deferential. Luca, still struggling in Seagal's grasp, looked up at the new arrivals, his confusion deepening. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. "Who are these guys?" "They're the ones who should have been here from the start," Seagal said quietly, releasing Luca with a single flick of his wrist. Luca crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. His pride was in tatters, his mind racing with questions. He had no idea who these men were, but they weren't part of his world. One of the men in suit stepped forward, holding up a folder of documents. "Mr. Seagal, we have everything in order. Your business in this city is official now. There's no going back for them." Luca's eyes widened, a dawning realization beginning to form in his mind. He turned to Seagal, his voice barely a whisper. "Wait, what are you talking about? What is this?" Seagal looked down at him one last time, his voice calm and final. "I'm the new owner of this city, Luca, and you're finished." And with that, the true scale of what had just happened began to sink in. The restaurant had fallen silent, the once buzzing atmosphere now replaced by a thick, palpable tension. The remaining Mafia thugs lay sprawled on the floor, nursing wounds they never expected to receive. Luca, the once intimidating leader, now found himself crumpled on the ground, gasping for breath, His pride shattered. His thoughts raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. Seagal stood tall and composed, his movements deliberate as he adjusted the sleeves of his jacket. He wasn't sweating, wasn't out of breath. He looked like a man who had simply finished an everyday task, like he had been walking through a park, not taking down an entire Mafia crew. To the onlookers, it was a sight to behold. This wasn't just any man. This was someone who moved with such precision and strength that they could hardly believe their eyes. The men in suits who had entered moments ago were still standing near the entrance, their expressions calm but alert. They seemed like a different breed altogether, cool, collected, and entirely in control of the situation. The restaurant's patrons, who had been awkwardly watching the entire ordeal unfold, now shifted in their seats. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with awe. Everyone was wondering the same thing. Who was this man? And what did this mean for the rest of them? The first man in the black suit, the one who had spoken earlier, stepped toward Luca. He had a look of disdain in his eyes, but it was mixed with something else. Pity, perhaps, or just a deep sense of inevitability. Luca, on the floor, looked up at him with confusion, his face still red from Seagal's grip. "You're lucky Seagal doesn't make a habit of this," the man said with a hint of amusement in his voice. "But you've made a lot of enemies. And not just here in this restaurant." Luca's mind was still reeling. He tried to push himself up but found it difficult. His body felt like it had been hit by a truck. His men were incapacitated, each of them groaning and trying to collect themselves. They were no longer the intimidating force they once thought they were. They were powerless against the quiet strength of one man. "Who are you?" Luca managed to choke out, his voice barely audible. "What is this? What's going on?" Seagal, still standing with that calm, measured expression, turned his attention to Luca. His eyes locked on the Mafia boss, and the rest of the room seemed to fade away. "This is the end for you, Luca. For your crew. For everything you've built. You're in a world of trouble you don't understand yet, but you will." Luca opened his mouth to protest, to demand an explanation, but before he could, the suited man cut him off. "You don't get to ask questions. You don't get to make demands. Not anymore." The silence in the restaurant deepened, and the tension in the air became unbearable. It was as if the very walls were holding their breath. The Mafia, once the kings of their domain, were now reduced to mere bystanders, trying to understand what had just happened. The fear was evident on their faces as they realized they were completely out of their depth. One of the patrons, a middle-aged man who had been quietly eating his meal in the corner, spoke up. His voice was shaky, but there was a sense of wonder in it. "Who is he?" he asked. More to himself than anyone else. What just happened here? A few heads turned in his direction, but the man in the suit who had been speaking earlier answered, his voice tinged with a sense of finality. "You've just witnessed the end of one era and the beginning of another." Luca's eyes narrowed as he processed this. "You don't understand. You're making a huge mistake. I'll make sure you regret this. You can't do this to me." Seagal didn't flinch. He didn't even look irritated. His calmness seemed to provoke Luca even more. "The mistake was never mine. Luca, it was yours the moment you decided to push people around, to think that violence and fear would make you invincible." Luca tried to stand again, but his legs were unsteady. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him, like a ton of bricks. He was realizing just how much power he had lost. How fragile the empire he had built truly was. He wasn't the king of anything anymore. In fact, he wasn't even a player. Not here. Not now. Seagal, noticing the shift in Luca's posture, took a step closer, his presence almost overwhelming. "You should have stayed in your lane. You should have realized that the world you were trying to control wasn't yours to begin with." Luca swallowed hard, his face contorting in frustration. "You don't know who I am," he spat, but his words sounded weak. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "I know exactly who you are," Seagal interrupted, his voice cold and final. "A man who has built his life on the suffering of others, who thinks power comes from intimidation. But power doesn't come from control. It comes from respect." Luca's face twisted in disbelief. "Respect? What do you know about respect?" Seagal didn't respond to that. He simply looked at Luca, his eyes filled with an understanding that came from years of experience, years of discipline and wisdom. Seagal had never needed to raise his voice to force others into submission. He knew that respect was earned, not demanded, and Luca had never earned it. The man in the suit who had spoken earlier stepped forward once again, pulling out a folder from inside his coat. "We've arranged for everything, Mr. Seagal. The paperwork is all set." Seagal nodded, his focus now shifting back to the Mafia crew. "I'll leave it to you," he said to the man in the suit. "But know this, Luca. You'll be out of business by morning. Every deal you've made, every connection you've relied on, gone." Luca, still reeling from the loss of control, opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind was spinning, his empire crumbling in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And just like that, the quiet man who had walked into the restaurant had changed everything. Without a single shout, without a single bullet fired, Steven Seagal had dismantled the very foundation of a criminal empire. The Mafia's reign was over, and the world would never look at power the same way again. Luca's world, once solid and secure, was crumbling faster than he could process. He sat there on the floor, his body aching from the brutal encounter, his mind unable to catch up with the reality unfolding around him. His empire, the network of fear and control he had so carefully built over the years, was unraveling. The quiet man before him, this seemingly unassuming figure who had dismantled his entire crew without breaking a sweat, was not just an adversary. He was a storm. The restaurant had fallen into a stunned silence. The few patrons who had been witnesses to the chaos were now murmuring to each other, exchanging nervous glances. The air was thick with disbelief and awe. No one had ever seen anything like this. One moment, the Mafia had been in full control, and the next, they were on their knees, utterly defeated. Seagal, as calm and composed as ever, stood at the center of the room, seemingly unaffected by the chaos he had just caused. His movements were precise, his posture relaxed, as though he had been taking a walk through the park rather than dismantling one of the most feared criminal organizations in the city. One of the suited men, the one who had spoken earlier, stepped forward again. His expression was stoic, professional, but there was a hint of admiration in his eyes as he addressed Seagal. "Mr. Seagal, everything is in order," the man said, his voice low and respectful. "We've handled the legalities. The transfer of assets is complete. Your position as the majority owner of the city's most influential businesses is official." Luca's mind raced. He couldn't wrap his head around it. He had thought this was just some random guy, some fool who had wandered into his path, someone who had no idea who he was dealing with. But now it was clear, this wasn't just some man off the street. This was someone who had orchestrated an elaborate takeover right under his nose. "You've been waiting for me," Seagal said, his voice steady as he looked at the men in suits. The suited man nodded, not missing a beat. "Yes, Mr. Seagal. We've been preparing for your arrival for months. All the groundwork has been laid. The paperwork, the assets, the contracts, they're all yours now. We just needed to make sure there were no distractions." Luca's jaw clenched, his frustration boiling over. You were planning this all along," he sputtered, still trying to grasp what was happening. "All of it. This whole thing was a setup." Seagal didn't flinch. He remained calm, his voice never raising above a controlled, quiet pitch. "It wasn't a setup, Luca. It was a process. A process that you were blind to. You were too busy flexing your muscles and intimidating people to realize that the world around you was changing." Luca shook his head in disbelief. "I don't understand. I thought I owned this town. I thought—" "You thought wrong," Seagal interrupted, his words sharp, cutting through the fog of Luca's confusion. "You didn't own anything. You thought you had power because people were afraid of you. Fear is weakness. You've been living a lie." Luca's eyes darkened. His mind was racing, trying to figure out how everything had slipped away from him so quickly. The Mafia had been the strongest force in the city, untouchable. How could it have all disappeared in an instant? And why had Seagal, a man who had shown no sign of aggression or ambition, decided to target him? What was the point of all of this? The suited man who had spoken before stepped forward once again, addressing the room. His voice was calm, but it carried an authority that seemed to fill the room. "Mr. Seagal's interest in this city goes beyond financial gain. It's about creating something better, something sustainable. You were a part of the old guard, an old way of doing business, and that way was destined to fail. Luca, who had been stewing in his defeat, finally found his voice. I built this. Everything you see, everything here, is mine. I made this city what it is, and you're just going to throw it all away. The suited man shook his head. No, Luca. You built something, but it was built on the backs of others. It was built on fear, on control, and on manipulation. That's why it was always doomed. What Seagal is doing is different. It's not about domination. It's about growth, prosperity, and, most importantly, respect. The words stung Luca, but he didn't fully understand them. He couldn't comprehend the change that was happening right in front of him. He had always believed that the world revolved around power and control. He had always believed that fear was the strongest tool at his disposal. And now, this quiet man, Seagal, was telling him that none of that mattered, that it was all a fafadada. Seagal glanced at Luca one final time. You may not understand it now, but you will. The world is changing, and you, Luca, are a relic of the past. It's time for you to step aside. Luca felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He opened his mouth to argue, but his words caught in his throat. The truth, as hard as it was for him to accept, was undeniable. He had lost. His empire was gone, and he had no control over what was coming next. Seagal turned away from him and addressed the rest of the room. The people who have worked for you, Luca, he said, the ones who were loyal to you, they deserve better. They deserve the chance to work in an environment where they are treated with respect, not fear. And that's what I'm offering them. Luca, feeling more humiliated by the moment, looked up, his eyes narrowing. You think they'll follow you? You think they'll trust you? Seagal paused, his gaze calm and unwavering. They'll trust the future I'm offering. It's a better future. With those words, Seagal turned his back on Luca, signaling the end of an era. As Seagal walked out of the restaurant, the suited men followed. Their business with Luca finished. The Mafia boss, now a shell of his former self, watched them leave, his mind whirling in disbelief. The quiet man, the one who had seemed so ordinary, had just taken everything from him. Without lifting a finger, without shedding a drop of blood. The lesson was clear. True power didn't come from control. It came from respect, and Seagal had earned it, without even trying. As Seagal exited the restaurant, the remaining patrons, still in shock, could only stare after him in awe. They had just witnessed the fall of one empire and the rise of another. One built on humility, respect, and quiet strength. And in that moment, they knew the world had just changed. The silence that followed Seagal's departure was deafening. The few patrons who had witnessed the spectacle sat frozen in their seats, still processing the surreal events that had just unfolded. The restaurant, once filled with the hum of conversation and clinking silverware, now felt like a tomb. The wreckage of the Mafia crew was strewn across the floor, their pride shattered, their power stripped away in a matter of minutes. And yet, in the midst of it all, the calm and composed figure of Steven Seagal had vanished as quietly as he had arrived. For Luca, the world seemed to close in around him. He remained on the floor, his body bruised and broken, his mind reeling with questions he didn't have answers to. How had this happened? How had everything he had built, everything he had worked for, crumbled so quickly? He had been the king of the city, the one everyone feared, the one everyone obeyed. And now, he was nothing. The Mafia men, still groaning and nursing their injuries, exchanged looks of disbelief. They had been brought to their knees by a man they had underestimated, a man who had shown no fear, no hesitation, and no mercy. They had thought they could bully him, intimidate him, and bend him to their will. But they were wrong, and now they were paying the price for it. The suited men who had entered with Seagal were now quietly going about their business. They moved with efficiency, collecting papers, checking documents, and speaking in hushed tones, as if they were handling something far more important than the broken remnants of a Mafia empire. They seemed completely unfazed by the chaos around them, their focus entirely on their work. But there was one person who wasn't going to let this moment pass without making her presence known. The old clerk from the back of the restaurant, the one who had stayed respectful even when the Mafia had taken over, slowly rose from her seat. She had witnessed everything: the arrogance of the Mafia, the quiet power of Seagal, and the utter destruction of Luca's empire. As she stood, her eyes scanned the wreckage of the restaurant, taking in the broken men on the floor, the shocked faces of the patrons, and the stoic expressions of the suited men. She felt something shift inside her. This was a moment of change, a turning point, not just for the city but for herself. The respect Seagal had shown, not only in his actions but in the way he had handled the situation, had struck a chord deep within her. She had seen how easily the Mafia had tossed aside their sense of honor, how they had treated people as nothing more than tools to be used, and she had seen how Seagal had used his quiet strength and wisdom to put an end to it all. She knew that in that moment she had witnessed a man who wasn't just fighting for power. He was fighting for something greater: dignity, respect, and fairness. And something told her that this wasn't just a one-time act of kindness. This was the way Seagal lived, by principles that others could only aspire to. Gathering her courage, the old clerk walked toward the group of suited men. Her hands trembled slightly, but her steps were steady. She had been in this business for years, long enough to know when a moment of opportunity had arrived. One of the men in the suits, noticing her approach, looked up with a faint but respectful nod. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice warm yet businesslike. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I've worked in this restaurant for decades. I've seen a lot of things, but nothing like this." Her voice was steady now, though it trembled slightly at the edges. "I saw the way he handled things, the way he treated everyone, how he respected us all, even when we weren't expecting it." The man nodded again, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Mr. Seagal is a man of great integrity. He doesn't tolerate what you just witnessed here. I'm not looking for anything from you," she continued, her voice growing more confident with every word. "But I want to ask one thing. What happens now? What happens to people like me? What happens to the ones who've spent their lives working in places like this, watching as people like Luca and his crew ran everything with fear and intimidation?" The man's gaze softened. "What happens now is that things change. Mr. Seagal is not here to destroy what's good. He's here to build a better future. One where people like you, people who have worked hard and shown respect, are valued." The old clerk blinked, surprised by the sincerity in the man's voice. She had heard enough empty promises in her life to know when someone was speaking the truth. This time, though, there was something different about what he was saying. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: it was going to be different. Better. "I want to help. I've seen enough to know that things have to change. I've lived through enough fear to know that it doesn't have to be that way." The suited man gave a small but genuine smile. Mr. Seagal values people who are willing to make that change, people who understand the importance of respect and integrity. "You may find that your future, and the future of this restaurant, will be much brighter than you expected." Just then, Seagal's calm voice broke through the conversation. "I see you've already made your decision," he said, walking back into the room with a quiet intensity. "I'm glad to see it. This city needs people like you." The old clerk, now standing taller than she had before, turned to face Seagal. She didn't know what the future would look like, but she felt a new sense of purpose, something she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she mattered. Seagal looked at her, his eyes steady and unwavering. "From today, you're the new branch manager. You've earned it." Her heart skipped a beat. "Me?" "Yes," he replied simply. "You've shown respect when no one else would. You've seen the bigger picture, and that's the kind of leadership this place needs." For the first time in years, the old clerk smiled. It wasn't just a smile of gratitude. It was a smile of empowerment, of knowing that the future was in her hands. As Seagal turned and walked out of the restaurant, the quiet was no longer filled with tension or fear. It was filled with something more. Hope the Mafia had fallen, but a new chapter had begun, and it was a chapter where respect, humility, and quiet strength would reign supreme. As the sound of Seagal's footsteps faded into the distance, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted once again. The dust hadn't just settled on the Mafia crew. It had settled on an entire way of life that had ruled the city for far too long. The restaurant, once a symbol of fear and corruption, now stood as a quiet testament to something much more powerful. Change. The patrons, who had watched the entire ordeal unfold, were left in stunned silence. They had witnessed the collapse of an empire built on intimidation, arrogance, and violence. They had seen a quiet man walk in, and with the calm of a seasoned professional, dismantle an entire criminal organization. But more than just the fall of Luca's empire, they had witnessed something more profound. The triumph of humility, respect, and strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. The Mafia had built its power on the backs of the city's most vulnerable, preying on their fear, using intimidation to maintain control. But Steven Seagal had shown them the truth. True power doesn't come from the ability to break others. It comes from the ability to empower them, to inspire loyalty not through fear, but through respect. In the end, Seagal wasn't just defeating the Mafia. He was dismantling a mindset, a way of life that had long gone unchecked. For Luca and his crew, the revelation came too late. They had thought they were the ones who held the keys to the city, but they had failed to see the one simple truth that had eluded them all along. Power built on fear is fragile. It can only last for so long before it collapses under the weight of its own instability. Respect, on the other hand, was a force that could not be destroyed, because it was rooted in something far deeper than just power. It was rooted in humanity, in decency, in the quiet strength that doesn't need to prove itself to anyone. As the evening wore on, the old clerk, now promoted to the new branch manager, stood at the center of the room, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had always been one of the quiet ones, the one who had kept her head down and done her job without complaint. She had watched the world around her crumble under the weight of arrogance and greed, but she had never been in a position to do anything about it. Until now. Seagal's decision to elevate her to a position of leadership had not just been a professional move. It had been a gesture that spoke volumes about the values Seagal embodied. It was about recognizing those who had endured, who had remained true to their principles, even in the face of adversity. It was about acknowledging that true strength lies not in dominating others, but in lifting them up. And as the new manager, she knew her responsibility was greater than ever. It wasn't just about managing the restaurant. It was about creating an environment where respect and humility would flourish. The old clerk, now the manager, looked out over the room, taking in the faces of the remaining patrons and staff. There were no more Mafia goons to fear, no more looming threats of violence or intimidation. There was only peace, and in that peace there was opportunity, a chance to build something better, something stronger. But she knew that it would take time, and it would take the effort of everyone who believed in the values that Seagal had demonstrated so effortlessly. She walked over to one of the patrons, an elderly woman who had been sitting at the back of the room throughout the ordeal. The woman looked up at her, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" the manager asked gently. The woman nodded, her eyes gleaming with a quiet wisdom. "I've seen a lot of things in my time," she said softly. "But this is something different. I've never seen someone stand up to power like that, without a single word of threat, without violence. It was like watching a storm pass through, leaving nothing but calm behind." The manager smiled, grateful for the woman's words. "I think that's what makes him different," she replied. "He doesn't need to shout. His actions speak louder than any words could." The elderly woman's smile deepened. "That's the kind of leader this world needs." And just like that, a small, almost imperceptible shift had taken place. The restaurant, which had once been a symbol of fear and violence, was now a symbol of change. And it wasn't just about the Mafia being defeated. It was about a new way of thinking, a new way of living. The old clerk, now the new manager, understood that the work had just begun. She would carry forward the lessons Seagal had unknowingly left behind. That power is not about dominance. It's about respect. It's about treating everyone with dignity, no matter their status. It's about the strength to remain calm in the face of adversity, and the humility to recognize that true power lies in uplifting others, not crushing them. As the night drew to a close and the patrons began to leave, there was a sense of calm in the air. The Mafia had been vanquished, yes, but more importantly, the city had been given a second chance. A chance to rebuild from the ashes of arrogance and fear. A chance to create something new, something better, and that change had started with one man, the quiet man who had walked into the restaurant that evening, and without a single raised fist, had changed everything. Seagal had taught them a lesson that would resonate for years to come. Respect isn't something you show only to the rich or powerful. It's something you show to everyone, even when you think no one is watching. Because you never know when the person you're looking down on might be the one you end up looking up to. It's the quiet ones, the humble ones, who often hold the greatest power. True strength is silent, true respect is earned, and the world, as they had just witnessed, is always full of surprises. The restaurant doors closed behind the last patron, and the new manager stood alone in the center of the room. She knew that the future was uncertain, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. The city had been given a new chance, and with it, so had she. And in that moment, as she looked around the restaurant that had borne witness to so much, she whispered to herself, "Respect is real strength." The door to a new era had opened, and there was no turning back.